Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Leslie McCall, Associate Professor of Sociology and Faculty Fellow in the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. McCall's work on class inequality among women in the United States, and more generally on how racial, educational, and gender inequality overlap and conflict with one another, has been published in a wide range of journals, as well as in her book entitled Complex Inequality: Gender, Class, and Race in the New Economy, 2001. That book was the first runner-up for the C. Wright Mills Book Award. Her current research includes an ongoing study of rising economic inequality among women, its political consequences, and the impact of corporate restructuring. McCall's work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and DEMOS, a network of ideas and action, where she was a senior fellow. McCall gave a lecture entitled The Undeserving Rich: American Perceptions of Inequality, Opportunity, and Redistribution on March 4, 2010, as part of the Great Expectations, Obama and the Politics of Reform Speakers Series, sponsored by the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics and the UO Political Science Department. Leslie, welcome.
Thank you.
We're really glad you could take the time to come and talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You have a great big huge topic, and then my first question is a great big huge question. But let me get you started, if you would, by pointing out, as you do in your work, that there has been a dramatic increase in economic inequality among Americans over the last generation or so. Can you explain the trend?
It's actually a trend that's occurred across the developed world. So it's not something that is unique to the U.S., although the U.S. does have a higher level of inequality to begin with, and it did increase more here than in other countries. But it's generally accepted that there are a wide range of factors that have contributed to rising inequality, and that this has occurred across the world. And those factors have to do with economic change, how there's been increasing technological innovation that has led to the need for people with higher skills and technological skills on the one hand, and automation in traditional manufacturing industries on the other, so that there's a lot of job loss in traditional industries, manufacturing industries. There's also global competition, so there are developing countries that are becoming developed and are able to produce a lot of the products that the U.S. and other developing countries used to produce. Those are some of the main economic explanations of rising inequality, and these pertain to and apply to a number of countries across the world. The U.S. is in no different situation with respect to those factors. What is different in the U.S. is that our economy and our labor market is structured a little bit differently, so that we don't have as many protections for workers. So corporations that are trying to respond to a new global and technological environment, they're free to let people go if they need to. They're free to hire whenever they want to. They have a lot of flexibility in how they run their corporations. They can downsize, they can upsize, they can subcontract, they can outsource. All of these words that I think have become popular in the discourse over the past 20 years or so. And that's what's happened. There's just been a tremendous amount of change in American corporations, and they have been able to change to such an extent that that there's just a tremendous amount of insecurity and instability in the labor market that you don't find in other countries, because if Europe has a lot of protections against letting people go, and then they have social service, a safety net for those who are let go, so people who are unemployed and or displaced because of their skills are no longer needed in the economy. Then they're able to spend some time out of the labor market getting retrained for the new economy. And you don't have that as much in the U.S. You have to scramble to get a new job, even though it may not pay as much or have the same benefits that your old job had. So essentially that's the context for the rising inequality. You have a lot of people doing very well in the new economy with their skills, and you have a lot of people who have been displaced by those transformations. And so that's a set of economic changes that have taken place, and they're political to the extent that our social policies affect the extent to which people can adjust to an economic transformation. But there is one other aspect of this that's been studied a lot, which is public policies that might mitigate actual earnings inequality. So not just job protection laws, but things like the minimum wage, making sure that the minimum wage keeps up with inflation, and policies that try to shape the way that economic development takes place, investment strategies, much more investment in retraining and developing the workforce. We don't have as extensive a program in retraining and redevelopment that other countries have, so that it's really geared towards trying to take or get the most out of our labor force. We're more likely to import workers with skills from other countries if we have a shortage. Nursing is such a great example of this. Instead of putting a lot of resources into training nurses in the U.S., we accept immigrants to the country who are able to take those jobs. Now, this is in no way, I think, an argument against immigration. It's just that's the kind of policy, that's the way it's part of the flexible labor force. It's not an investment in training here. We are able actually to keep up with economic change through a lot of different avenues, one of which is immigration. So there are a number of different political and policy determinants of rising inequality. And just one final one that I would mention is the sort of political gridlock and polarization between the Democrats and Republicans. It makes it very difficult to address such a large issue as inequality, which really, as you can see, it has many causes. It would require a complex response. But when you have a politically gridlocked system, then it's very difficult to get movement on such a large issue, an important issue to so many people. So there's kind of piecemeal policies that help here and there, such as extending unemployment benefits and that sort of thing, and small increases in the minimum wage. But overall, there hasn't been any major attention to the issue politically, whereas in other countries, they have a much more extensive welfare state, which supports and redistributes income. So even though they've had an increase in earnings inequality, they've used the welfare state to reduce income inequality. That is sort of the total income from both working in the labor force as well as from the government. Again, that's not to say that that's a better system. It's a reason why the U.S. has a much higher level of both earnings inequality and income inequality.
Is that historically the case, that the degree of inequality is higher in the U.S. than it is in other developed countries? Actually,
it's not. The U.S. Was well known in the post-war period for having not only a high growth rate, high employment, high growth, up through the 60s, but for having income growth be evenly distributed across the population. If anything, income inequality decreased somewhat over the 3 decades after World War II. So there were many factors actually that affected the level of income inequality during that period that made us actually comparable to other countries.
So it's over the last 4 decades approximately that we've noticed this marked change?
Right, yes.
Now, it's been said that Americans are more accepting than other cultures of disparities of income and wealth, but that part of the American ethos is to care about equality of opportunity. Do you agree with that?
I don't actually agree with that. I think the problem is in how the two have been opposed to each other, so that either you care about inequality or you care about opportunity. You don't care about both. And that Americans care about opportunity to the extent that they are much more optimistic about the ability of hard work and effort to get ahead, to enable someone to be upwardly mobile, so you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps. They believe in that possibility much more than people do in other countries comparably, countries with a comparable level of income and growth. At the same time that Americans have this kind of optimism, they are very much concerned about income inequality. It's just that we don't typically ask them about whether they're interested in inequality, because we assume that because they believe that, or appear to believe that there is a lot of opportunity in this society, and our indicator of that is that they think hard work works. It matters for upward mobility. That they also think that there are some inequities, that opportunities are not equal, and that connections, knowing the right people, the family you're from, your racial background, these sorts of aspects do affect your ability to get ahead, to climb the economic ladder. And because of that, because there are restrictions, these kinds of barriers to opportunity, the outcomes of the economic game or race are not seen as fair. The outcomes or inequality would be fair if there was equal opportunity. But just because Americans believe in the ability of hard work and effort to lift people up, just because they believe that doesn't mean that they don't think that there are actually barriers in practice, and that these restrict opportunities and therefore the outcomes are not completely fair. And in particular, I think that they are viewing aspects of inequality as themselves barriers, aspects of earnings and income inequality as barriers to getting ahead. So let me just give you one example. To the extent that executives at financial firms, or those who work in the investment firms that were involved in some of the more securitizing of mortgages and the problems that were created as a result of those faulty and risky investments. The idea is that in some way was driven not by a real concern about growing the economy and creating jobs for Americans, but by making a return that benefited the people who worked in those businesses, but didn't benefit the rest of the country, and in fact was very harmful to the country and had a spillover effect that harmed millions of people. And I call this sort of, and that restricts opportunity. Once we go into a downturn or a recessionary period and there's trouble throughout the economy, people lose jobs. They become dependent on a number of different sources that are unstable. Maybe they've got a part-time job that pays less than they used to. Maybe they lose their benefits. Maybe they rely on another family member. It's very difficult to get by. So I think that looking at that kind of scenario, I think implies that there is excessive pay in some quarters, that maybe leads to disincentives and distorts incentives towards creating jobs and economic growth that would benefit the country as a whole. And so I refer to that sort of perception of inequality as a perception of people at the top as being undeserving of their pay. And I contrast that with the idea of the deserving rich. And I think Americans very much respect those who are rich and those who run businesses and those who are entrepreneurs. And I think part of the respect is because they think that benefits the whole country. And so when they perceive that pay is being directed towards those who may be engaging in practices that harm the country, then they sort of perceive that as an unfair form of inequality that restricts opportunity. So in this sense, inequality and extreme pay disparities may itself be harming opportunities to get ahead. And this is how I think that we connect the two. It's not either a belief in opportunity or inequality, but we see inequality as a potential barrier to opportunity.
Got it. Yeah, I see. So the two terms are not, they're not mutually exclusive. They're very much implicated, one in the other.
Exactly.
Yeah. You alluded very briefly to the factor of race. I want to ask you to elaborate on how race and also gender factor into inequalities and disparities of the kinds you've been addressing.
It's a complicated question. I'll try to address it in a couple of different ways, but try to be brief. The first is that remarkably the increase in inequality has occurred across groups. So there's an increase in inequality among women. There's an increase in inequality among blacks, among Latinos. You know, this is a process that is pervasive. You have people getting ahead in all groups, and then you have people falling behind in all groups. That is racial and gender groups. So if we were to look at trends in earnings inequality in each of these groups, you'd see an enormous rise in inequality among women. So there's an increasing gap among those who, for example, have higher education and those who have a high school or less education. And in fact, women have been beneficiaries. Those who are educated have really been beneficiaries of the incredible growth and demand in for high skill workers. That demand that I talked about earlier, that technological shifts towards a more educated workforce, really drew in and relied upon women who now are actually more likely to get a college degree than men. And you also have increasing bifurcation among blacks. So you have those who are able to rise through the economic and the educational ladder, and are very accomplished in terms of their educational credentials. But then you have a real gap between them and those who have not been able to even finish high school. So that's it. So in some ways, gender and race are not, I wouldn't say they're irrelevant, but they're operating in a way, or gender inequality and racial inequality need to be understood within this different context of overall rising inequality, so that we can't talk about groups as single unified groups anymore. I think that's the most important lesson in this trend. But there are, of course, particular problems for women at the top as well as at the bottom, and there are particular problems. So there's still discrimination at the top against women and against minorities, no question about it. Wall Street is still very much a white and a male bastion, as is corporate America. So I don't in any way want to diminish that. I think there's been very little progress on that front. And then you also continue to have racial segregation, income segregation that really harms and separates people of different incomes and races into unequal neighborhoods that then result in unequal educational opportunities and so on. So I think that if we were then to move away from the idea, well, there's increasing inequality among everyone, at the same time, there are also very specific racial and gender dimensions to this problem as well.
Got it. I see. So can we turn it a little bit then and look at it through a different lens and ask you about demographic trends? Does that lead to a meaningful explanation of what can help account for the growing inequalities?
That's a complicated question, because demographic trends, oftentimes people point to increasing immigration, for example, as a demographic trend that might have led to rising inequality. And by that they mean that the rise in immigration led to an increase in those who are low-waged workers who receive low earnings and income, and therefore the bottom has gone down because of the increase in immigration, and that's why we have an increase in inequality. That explanation has not held up to empirical scrutiny. So immigration does not seem to be a primary. It's a there are so many factors that are contributing factors. That's one, but it's a small one. It certainly doesn't explain the increase in earnings at the top. There's no way immigration can explain that trend. So that's one demographic factor. It is possible that there are some factors, demographic factors, that have to do with the change in college, in entering. We have an increase in college attendance, but we don't have very much of an increase in four-year college graduation rates. So there's clearly something going on here. We have more and more people going to college, but we don't have very many more graduating from college. And that might be why we have a skills deficit. It might be why those people who do have a college education get, some of them, with a graduate degree and more advanced training, get much higher wages relative to those at the bottom. And there are various ways in which demographic changes may be at play there as well.
In what you've been saying, education keeps coming up, and it sounds as though maybe that's one factor that can be teased out from all of the complex interacting factors as a determiner or a pretty good predictor.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the education is important, but it's also, again, just one aspect, and certainly policy is relevant here. So even if it is education, and education is an important factor, then some of the issues that become important is creating equal educational opportunities, so that people have an early start at a good education. There's a lot of emphasis now on that, and that the people who are not completing college are given the resources that they need or the environment that they need in order to complete college. So I would hate to have the message be that it's just about an individual sticking to their schooling and getting ahead through hard work and education. It's really much more. Our educational system is much more fraught with challenges than we can, I think, solve through just individual effort. And so while that's part of the problem, I think that what we really need to do is think about from the very beginning of a child's childhood all the way through college completion and beyond, that there needs to be a lot more effort put into that process. So then that creates a skilled and diversely skilled workforce in the U.S.
Yeah, those are two different things, right?
Yes.
Diversely skilled and diverse.
Right, and,
yeah.
and diverse in terms of class background as well as racial background.
I wanted to get back a little bit to the title of your talk, which is so provocative, and the whole notion of the undeserving rich. First of all, I'm assuming you chose that term because it does provoke discussion and thought. Is that right?
Yes, but it also is to be contrasted with a very common phrase, at least in academic research, which is the undeserving poor. And I believe it's also something that's relatively common in public discourse as well. So that the poor do not deserve welfare, for example. So they're undeserving. That's why we needed to change the welfare system. And there's just an enormous amount of attention paid to those who do not deserve government assistance, the poor. I just wanted to focus, shift attention to the rich and treat them like the poor, in the sense that we know that there are the deserving poor and we know that there are the undeserving poor. Let's take that as a fact. Then why not also think about that with respect to the rich as well, because they're an enormously important group in American society, and they're respected and they have very high prestige and they do a lot to produce the country that we know and love. I'm sounding like President Barack Obama right now. But I do believe that that's the way they're perceived by the American public. But at the same time, they should be responsible as well. That comes with obligations and responsibilities.
So the whole discussion really gets down to what we might consider our core values as a culture, right?
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so, and just applying those values across the board. you know, applying the notion of obligation and responsibility to those at the top as well as those at the bottom and in the middle.
Speaking of the middle, if inequality is growing, if there are more people who are at the bottom end of the spectrum and more of the rich, whether deserving or undeserving, what's happening to the middle class? Is the middle class disappearing?
It's tough to actually empirically measure that, so I'm going to avoid that question. There are some people who say it is, and then there are some people who say that it isn't. What is very interesting about the middle is that I think in families in the middle were able to gain ground. Their income and inflation-adjusted terms grew up until the late 90s. But over the 2000s, it actually stagnated. So median family income did not grow over the period from 2000 to the present. That is it always grows between recessionary periods. Okay, so there's a recession, it's low at that point, and then all the way to the next recession, you would see growth in family income. As the economy grows, so should family income. This is the first time since statistics have been collected that median family income has not grown over the business cycle, and this business cycle was over the 2000s. We think that's because women in the family started to work over in the 70s and 80s and more hours and 90s, and that's what enabled family income to grow. People worked more as more members of the family worked. And there's no more hours in the day for people to work anymore, women or men, and so we don't see a great increase in the hours of work in families, total hours of work among families in the 2000s. It really stopped, and I think that's one reason why median income has now stagnated.
You know, I hate to say it, but we're out of time. I'm going to have to stop you there. But thank you very much for beginning to explain what are very complicated equations.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We have been speaking with Leslie McCall, Associate Professor of Sociology and Faculty Fellow in the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. She gave a lecture entitled The Undeserving Rich, American Perceptions of Inequality, Opportunity, and Redistribution. It was presented on March 4, 2010 as part of the speakers series entitled Great Expectations, Obama and the Politics of Reform. That series was sponsored by the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics and the UO Political Science Department. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.